And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will let's get this started. So good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Kwok. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the director for on climate disaster resilience for Philanthropy California, an alliance of Northern California grantmakers, Southern California grantmakers, and the catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties. We want to say thank you so much for joining us for our program on addressing data gaps for equitable implementation of climate and disaster resilience solutions in California. So this program is part of Philanthropy California's expanded efforts to address the causes of disasters that we have experienced in our state for the past few years. So our work is guided by four beliefs in advancing climate disaster resilience. First, we believe that there's nothing natural about disasters. Society, not society, not nature, creates disasters, and disasters don't have to happen if we make the right investment at the right time in the right places. In that, we believe that solutions to climate risk and disaster resilience are best designed and carried out by communities closest to the problems, with private and public support. Thirdly, we want to center people's solutions to the problems they face, and that we focus on racial equity and social justice. So therefore, much of our work on climate disaster resilience, we prioritize communities of color. And lastly, we understand that philanthropy is is a small change compared to much of the resources provided by the state and other businesses. So that climate challenges cannot be solved by one sector alone. They must be involved in a multi-sector collaboration between businesses, governments, nonprofits, and philanthropy. So our work here at Philanthropy California around climate disaster resilience are a fivefold. One is we advocate. We advocate on behalf of philanthropic sector on equitable climate and disaster policies at the local, state, and federal level. We also provide information and education to the funding community on emerging issues and trends and how philanthropy can best be a great player and be most effective in this work. We also help our funders coordinate around wildfire resilience and climate health and equity issues. And our role is also to connect funders with each other and with government agencies to enhance collaboration and coordination. And when a disaster strikes, we help the philanthropic community by responding to different disasters, including extreme wildfire events, by sharing information about where and you can give. So this morning, we are very fortunate to have four experts with us to discuss the importance of having accurate and integrated data to help inform policymakers and grant makers to make the right decisions and so that they can allocate resources to where is most needed. We know that having good data is essential to help direct resources to most in need. And we have seen that, during the current COVID-19 pandemic, where data about who is at risk and who is most impacted by COVID-19 are crucial to the development of outreach strategies around PPEs, education, and vaccination in our socially marginalized communities. So as our state is slowly recovering from the socioeconomic and health impacts of the pandemic, we are confronted by the recurring climate crisis, from heat waves to wildfires. So our experts this morning will discuss the data gaps throughout the continuum of climate risk to disaster response and recovery, and how these data gaps impact our most socially marginalized communities in getting the resources they need to mitigate, adapt to, respond to, and recover from extreme climate risk and events. So these experts on your screen, they are Sona Monot from the Green Lining Institute and Ami Ravel from the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. We also have Teresa Feo from the California Council on Science and Technology and Gabriel Herrera from the North Bay Organizing Projects. So please welcome all of them for this morning. Before we dive in, we want to, if all of the speakers, can you turn on your mic, and we're going to just do 3 quick rounds of lightning questions, just to get a sense as to where you stand on these questions. The first question is, Do you think we have all the data we need to make effective policy and funding decisions to address our climate crisis? I'll go with Teresa.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, and it's great to be here speaking with everyone. To
So
your
this a
question,
yes,
Alan,
yeah, yes, no, or yes and no?
yes. I would say yes to act today, and we'll need better data to make better informed decisions in the future.
Great. And Gabriella?
I say yes.
Okay. And Ami?
Yes, absolutely.
And Sona?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think we are investing enough resources to address gaps in our knowledge around these crises? Again, Teresa?
No.
Gabby?
Investing enough resources to address the gaps.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. And Ami?
No.
And Sona?
No.
Okay. And last question. Do you believe philanthropy can play a bigger role in addressing all the different gaps or, data challenges that we are experiencing as it relates to our current climate crisis? And Teresa?
Absolutely yes.
And Gabby?
The same thing, absolutely. Big with a capital A.
Okay. And Ami?
Yes.
And Sona?
Yes, definitely.
Great, thank you. And so what I'm going to do is I will, as all of you are here, we will have Sona as well as Ami first to really talk about the first part of our continuum around climate risk and data gaps or integration challenges around data. So Sona and Ami, I'm going to turn over to you and have you share your screen.
Can you see my screen? The PowerPoint?
Yes, we can. We can also see the rest of your screen, but can you make it full size or is it possible? Great. If not, that is okay. We can see your screen.
How's that?
Okay.
Great.
That will work. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Ami's actually going to be kicking us off, so I'll turn it over to you, Ami.
Great. Thank you, Sona. And good morning, everyone. Sona and I are going to do a brief overview of some of our work collaboratively between APEN and Greenlining to ensure equitable and data-driven climate resilience policy in California. So we did want to open with a few slides because I do think it'll help really ground in some of the long-term work we've been engaging in to address these questions. Next slide. So just to contextualize, as Alan already has, we see the ways that California is being pushed to extremes, and the record heat, fire, and pollution all have one thing in common. They've been made worse by climate change. And so we know that the climate crisis isn't far off in the future. It's here today, and it's more intense than ever. While we see in headlines scientists saying we've lost complete control and that there isn't a normal anymore, I do want to uplift that for the communities that APEN works with, our environmental justice communities, there's nothing new about cumulative health burdens because they've been plagued with chronic conditions due to polluting industries for generations. So just want to name, there's historic burdens we're really thinking about. Next slide. And just to contextualize this in the Bay Area where APEN works, last summer we saw a heat wave hit in the third weekend of August. That led to rolling power outages and a failure at the wastewater treatment plant and dumped tens of thousands of gallons of sewage into the bay, which meant during a heat wave, folks couldn't actually cool off when they were looking for a respite. Simultaneously in Richmond, where we also organize, our communities live on the fence line of the Chevron refinery. And that weekend flaring sent black smoke in the area, meaning that families had to close their windows to prevent from smoke, but meaning they also were limited in terms of cooling off. That weekend wrapped up with a lightning storm and a series of other really extreme weather conditions. But I highlight this set of slides only to name, and these headlines to name that this is what we talk about when we say cascading disasters and cumulative impacts. Next slide. And those are the lived experiences and stories that we really wanted to visibilize and in policymaking. And we worked on a report called Mapping Resilience that really seek to explore and build out that question. How do we visibilize those lived experiences and stories? How can maps really support us in legitimizing, acknowledging, and doing something about those impacts? Next slide. Folks may be familiar with CalEnviroScreen, which was one impetus of this Mapping Resilience project, because we've seen the way CalEnviroScreen as a statewide tool has really uplifted and centered the needs of our environmental justice communities. And it's a model for applying data in state policymaking. And we're seeing the federal government really look to CalEnviroScreen in developing some of their tools in the past. Next slide. We do know, though, that CalEnviroScreen had limits and didn't really look at climate change impacts, in part because that wasn't the question it was looking to answer. It was really focused on pollution and poverty. And this set of considerations around projected climate change impacts was a gap that our Mapping Resilience report was aiming to explore further. So the report provides background on communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change threats, both in California and beyond. It provides some key framing, and it looks at over 40 different data frameworks and tools to really think about climate vulnerability. And it does an analysis and assessment of where these tools are strong, where there are gaps, where, across tools we're seeing data gaps, and also some policy applications of these types of data frameworks. Next slide. So some of the key recommendations that we push is that there really wasn't a single framework in California to overlay social vulnerabilities and climate threats. And what we know is that just displaying the climate science alone is insufficient in answering the questions that our communities need and addressing the problems that they're impacted by, because it's not just the climate science and the threats, it's the existing historic burdens and inequities that are the deciding factor whether communities have the resources to respond. So we saw a lot of gaps in the landscape, and we really pushed that policymakers would benefit from a streamlined framework. Next slide. Of course, we know that data alone is not sort of the only solution. It's just one part. And so we did also ground, in addition to pushing for a statewide mapping platform, that communities really be partners as part of uplifting their lived experiences, their stories, their expertise in terms of the climate change impacts that are they're most concerned about, and how those impacts are interplaying with neighborhood conditions and their capacity to respond. So I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Sona to talk more about how this research and advocacy has evolved into state policymaking.
Thanks so much, Ami. And yeah, now that Ami's done a really great job exploring and sharing the foundation for this idea of a mapping tool that identifies the most climate vulnerable communities, I wanted to share what implementation of this idea has looked like. So through the past 2 years with Greenlighting and APEN's advocacy, we've been really able to socialize this idea that we need this type of mapping platform that's comprehensive and user-friendly. And we've been able to get a lot of buy-in from policymakers, especially different state agencies like the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, the California Environmental Protection Agency, California Natural Resources Agency, and so on. And through our advocacy, we feel that our policymakers understand that there is a need for such a tool to ensure that decision makers throughout California have the information needed so that we can make targeted policy and investment decisions to really help communities that are on the front lines of climate change. And so we're really excited to share share that the Governor's Office of Planning and Research was able to secure funding to develop and house this integrated statewide mapping tool that Ami described within their office. And so the platform will be specifically housed under OPR's Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program, or ICARP, which works to develop a coordinated response and approach to the impacts of climate change across the state of California. And in addition to funding to develop the tool, we were really excited to see that in the governor's May revised budget proposal, there was an allocation of $5 million for ICARP, as well as a new vulnerable communities platform. So we're hoping to see this show up in the final state budget once the details get finalized. And in addition to developing the actual platform, one of the most critical components of this whole idea is ground truthing the data that Ami just talked about. We want to make sure that in addition to scientific data, that we're looking at narratives and experiential knowledge from communities to capture what quantitative data can't tell us, really getting to some of the gaps that Alan was speaking about at the beginning. And so our vision for this mapping platform includes convening a community advisory committee consisting of members from different frontline communities that have experienced major climate impacts. Could include members of disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, tribal communities, and disabled access and functional needs communities, as well as other populations that are at high risk from different climate change impacts. And this piece around the Community Advisory Committee is really the transformative element, or one of the transformative elements of this entire concept. We're trying to find ways to shift power and ensure that people and communities who have been most impacted, as Ami mentioned, for generations, not just now with increasing climate impacts, but those who are also on the front lines of climate change have power to influence policy decisions that will impact them and can help build healthier and more resilient environments. And so our vision for this committee is a very collaborative partnership model where state agencies and the Community Advisory Committee would work together in close partnership to shape key elements of what the mapping platform would include, such as how it's designed, what uses it could be designed for, and what are the specific data sets or indicators that we want to see. And really importantly, our goal for this committee is to be independently funded through philanthropic support and to operate outside of any single agency process. And this is really to help ensure that the community groups participating have a lot of ownership over vision setting, agenda development, and other key items. So this is something that we encourage our philanthropic partners to engage on. And if you'd like to learn more or be interested in supporting this work, definitely feel free to reach out to Ami or myself. And the last thing I wanted to share before turning it back to Alan is an initiative that LA County is already working on that could help inform what the statewide mapping platform looks like. Some folks might know about this already, but LA County is developing a climate vulnerability assessment that'll look at the county's social and physical vulnerability to climate hazards like extreme heat, flooding, and wildfire to really help guide their different adaptation, emergency preparedness, and resilience strategies and efforts that the county is working on. And this assessment will also include mapping tools that visualize these findings. And so the reason I wanted to bring this up is because one of the key components of the vulnerability assessment is intentionally showing the connections between social and physical vulnerability. And from our perspective, it's really critical to think about vulnerability assessments and mapping tools beyond physical infrastructure and climate hazards, but to really incorporate socioeconomic data and vulnerabilities. And the reason is because if we don't include this, it will be hard to get a really holistic, complete picture of who's most vulnerable to different climate disasters. Just thinking about in the Bay Area, a lot of communities are very vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding, but we have to look beyond the hazard risk itself and how strong physical infrastructure is against the threat of sea level rise to really understand which communities are most at risk. Some communities might have financial resources to go to a hotel or an Airbnb, or might have infrastructure to protect their homes or transportation in case they need to evacuate. But if you don't have these resources or are unable to access them, then those communities will be even more vulnerable to the threat of sea level rise and flooding. And so these social vulnerability factors which really focus on adaptive capacity and sensitivity that APEN's Mapping Resilience Report goes into a lot of detail about. They really have to be included in vulnerability assessments and mapping tools to give the fullest and most holistic picture of who's most at risk. And so this is what we're hoping to see the statewide mapping tool do, and it's what LA County is already doing, which we're excited to see. And yeah, just included, they have an upcoming workshop next week if anybody's interested in attending that. So thank you for your time. And yeah, that concludes our presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ami and Sona. I have a quick question before we turn it to Teresa. This is a great opportunity for the expansion of what LA is doing to include statewide. So this vulnerability mapping that intersects social and physical as well as ecological, vulnerabilities. I am just curious around, because wildfires, for example, is one of those, major climate hazards that we are experiencing, every summer. Are there any attempts to also kind of map out who might be most at risk as well as might be impacted by wildfires so that you have a whole continuum, a mapping that looks into not only vulnerability, but also into response as well as recovery and impacts?
Yeah, I would just say that our mapping resilience report actually covers, if folks take a look and are interested, vulnerabilities and sort of the science and tools that can be overlaid across those multiple climate impacts from sea level rise, fire, heat, and drought. And so we definitely know that an integrated tool needs to include all of those climate risks and additionally others. Pollution is another, like wildfire smoke, harder to measure, but it needs to be adaptive across multiple climate impacts. Absolutely. And that data is changing, as you mentioned, Ellen, because of our evolving understanding and evolving conditions.
And we have another question in the chat box, but we have plenty of time in the end of the at this presentation to answer that question. So I think that question around the 40+ categories of data points that you're looking at, Ami and Sona, hopefully you can have those have your answer ready during the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Teresa Feo from the CCST, and she's really going to talk about the impacts, the cost of the impacts of wildfires. So Teresa, go ahead.
Thank you. Let's get the screen share going. Okay, does everyone see my screen? Excellent, thank you. It's great to be here today. My name is Teresa Feo, and I'm a senior science officer with the California Council on Science and Technology. And today I'm going to talk about a peer-reviewed report we published in 2020 looking at the costs of wildfire. So just first, a little bit of context about who we are. The California Council on Science and Technology is a nonpartisan nonprofit in Sacramento. And we were created at the request of the state legislature to be a source of science and policy advice to the state. And so we maintain a network and partnerships with many of the state's leading academic and research institutions. And with that network of experts, we deliver a number of science services that are designed to help bring, cutting edge science and technology advice to state policymakers. And one of the ways we do that is through our peer-reviewed reports, which look at basically synthesizing the current scientific consensus on a topic. And so this project started, basically in 2019. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation held a workshop looking at how we can improve our response to wildfires. And that effort identified a number of critical needs, including the need to have better cost-benefit analyses so that we could weigh, the benefits of more investment in prevention and mitigation against the costs of reactive recovery. And so with funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, CCST put together a steering committee of experts and authors, including myself, to look at what we don't know about the costs of wildfire. And so we conducted a comprehensive review of the scientific literature, reports, and publicly available data sets to, basically look into the data that we have and we don't have. And we took a very wide approach. There's a lot of details in our report, but the sort of three main takeaways from the report is, first, we can't come up with a number. So it's not possible to come up with a statewide calculation of the total full costs of wildfire in the state with the currently available data. We do know some things. Some costs are well quantified. We know, for example, suppression spending by state and federal governments, prevention and mitigation spending by utility companies, and insured property losses. And these costs that we do have well quantified at the state level are now approaching tens of billions of dollars annually, which is just a profoundly high cost to the state. But there are also many costs that are currently unquantified sort of at this statewide level. And so what we're left with are either no estimates of the costs or a handful of individual research projects that look at, say, a particular fire or a particular year and give us estimates. From this, we know that we don't have good estimates of the costs of health impacts, particularly wildfire smoke, things like uninsured property losses, and many of the impacts to California's ecosystem services. So loss of sequestered carbon, impacts to our water supply and water quantity, air quality, stuff like that. But what we do know from the research suggests that these currently unquantified costs are actually also very large, also in the tens of billions of dollars. So we know that wildfires are expensive and very costly to the state. And what we don't know is probably as large or larger than what we do know. And so the main recommendation out of our report is to invest in better tracking of these wildfire costs, particularly for these areas where we know very little. And the priority here being the cost of wildfire smoke, because this appears to be basically the largest unquantified cost that we currently have. As we've all learned after 2020 and living in California, smoke travels very far from the wildfire. And so fires across the state can inundate the entire state in very hazardous air quality. And as a consequence of this, right, many more people are exposed to wildfire smoke than to the wildfire, which means that the wildfire smoke appears to be more deadly than the actual wildfire. Estimates of the wildfire smoke suggest that, while the wildfires themselves may be killing tens of people, the wildfire smoke is killing hundreds or thousands of people in the state. So it's a profoundly huge impact that's currently going unquantified. And so following the publication of the report, we're now in conversation with state policymakers and federal policymakers. And one of our prime recommendations is to do better tracking of the wildfire smoke. And we need that because, if we don't have this good tracking, then smoke impacts can't be incorporated into, for example, the mapping tool that Sonia and Amy just talked about, right? So we need these baseline statistics so that we can understand who's being impacted by the smoke and make sure that we're not leaving anyone out of the equation. And one thing that becomes really clear when we start thinking about the smoke is that, it's impacting communities hundreds of miles away from the fire. And so communities that aren't traditionally thought of as being at risk of wildfire or impacted by wildfire. And the research suggests that, people that work outside, construction workers or farm workers, particularly those that don't have access to paid time off, are particularly vulnerable to wildfire smoke because they still have to be outside laboring in hazardous conditions. Instead of, not just sort of folks living in the forest or near the forest, but communities, within the dense urban cores of San Francisco and LA, right, can be profoundly impacted. People experiencing homelessness or people that otherwise can't access clean indoor air shelters, right, are going to be profoundly impacted by this. And so if we don't count the smoke, then these populations are going to sort of go unrecognized as at risk of wildfire or as potential beneficiaries of increased investment in prevention and mitigation. So that's my general summary. The report covers a lot. So if there are other things you're interested in besides public health and smoke impacts, there's a lot more I can talk about, a lot more recommendations and a lot other data that we're not tracking at the state level. That is also very important. So happy to talk about that further. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. Quick question. You mentioned that much of our unquantifiable data, including wildfire smoke, has not been tracked. What do you see as some of the either strategies or efforts that will lead to better tracking of these unquantifiable data?
Yeah, so I think some of the next steps that we're looking into is one, recognizing that these actually are quite large costs before the state, and therefore there is a benefit for coordinating some sort of statewide effort or comprehensive effort. One of the problems we find is that there's a lot of ways to count some of these impacts. So there's a lot of different ways you could count the impacts of, say, wildfire smoke. You can count asthma attacks or mortality or heart attacks, right? And that's what the individual research papers are doing. And they come up with large numbers, but because they're using different methods or metrics, you can't start adding them together and looking at trends over time or making comparisons. And so one of our follow-up recommendations is to standardize metrics, right? So that all of this different effort that's going into understanding these impacts, that they can be reported in standardized metrics, and we can start to build these comprehensive data sets, that are necessary to include in sort of the mapping projects and the follow-on assessments.
Thank you. So everyone, if you are on, feel free to continue to chime in your questions in the chat box, and we'll have probably 15 minutes of Q&A at the end to open up to all of you. So next, we talked about the climate risk, and now we talk about wildfire impacts, and and the next speaker, Gabriel Herrera from the North Bay Organizing Project, is really going to talk about how all of these data, impact our most socially marginalized communities, including farm workers and undocumented folks. So Gabby, I will have you give you the mic.
Great, thank you, Alan. Yes, my name is Gabriela Orantes. I go by Gabby for short as well, she, her, ella pronouns, and I am here representing the North Bay Organizing Project, and excited and eager for the questions that will come, more questions that will come out in the conversations with the panelists. For those that don't know, the North Bay Organizing Project is a grassroots, multiracial, and multi-issue organization comprised of over 22 faith, environmental, labor, student, and community-based organizations in Sonoma County. I am the Just Recovery Fellow at NBOP, and I've been tasked in this role. I've supported the Just Recovery Partnership, of which North Bay Organizing Project is a core partner. And this is an initiative out of the Latino Community Foundation, which I will share more about as an example of ways in which funders can support that nimble funding that is needed during disasters, after disasters, and before. So the disasters that struck Sonoma County, beginning with the wildfires in 2017, and the corresponding responses by government and civil society, continue to exacerbate deep inequities in our community. NBOP's response is centered on the concept of a just recovery, which is a recovery focused on the needs of people and the planet, a deepened democracy, and racial and environmental justice. Environmental events, as our speakers have highlighted already, are not inherently unjust. Rather, vulnerability to the effects of disaster are informed by gender, ethnicity, language, socioeconomic status, special needs, age, housing tenure, and most importantly, the ways in which government, philanthropy, and civil society respond to residents. To date, disaster response and recovery efforts in our community have systemically excluded the most vulnerable among us. In past events, non-English speakers, renters, and undocumented individuals have all reported significant gaps in disaster resources. And since 2017, NBOP's efforts have been centered on responding to the inadequacies of the ways in which our communities have been systemically excluded. One of those ways that I will focus on is on DocuFund, which came out of the 2017 wildfires as well. It is housed and administrated by North Bay Organizing Project, but was developed by two other organizations in Sonoma County, North Bay Jobs with Justice, and the Great and Day Labor Center, with the support of several funders, and who knew from the get-go that this was the response that community needed, and it stood up within a matter of days of the wildfires. And the focus and the aim was to ensure that undocumented residents who had been affected, not necessarily through property loss, some through property loss, but others through evacuations and wage loss, would need support. And the 2017 wildfires definitely exposed the ways in which systemically our undocumented community members are left out of the responses and the support mechanisms. So the report, one of the reports that came out of our efforts with UndocuFund is a key report, Diversifying Documentation with UndocuFund, and an examination of post-disaster narratives, which I believe was shared, and I can share the report in the chat shortly. But this, I want to highlight two key findings and recommendations that still stand and that we're seeing very relevant today, as we have gone through 3 other major fires and the pandemic. And so just real quickly, during and after the 2017 Tubbs fire, significant news coverage revolved around experiences of undocumented individuals in times of disaster. And according to the Public Policy Institute of California, as of 2014, more than 2 million undocumented immigrants resided in California. Of this population, 15,500 undocumented immigrants resided in Napa County and 38,500 in Sonoma County. And while they continue to be a large part of our community, undocumented individuals also remain remarkably vulnerable to natural disaster. You can see this in every disaster since the compounding disasters with the pandemic. And so to address this reality after the Tubbs fire, a joint effort called UndocuFund was launched and has been active ever since. For the most part, the work of UndocuFund has been done to address the systemic ways in which our undocumented neighbors and residents are left out by challenging existing policy and legal infrastructures, and by commenting on existing plans and frameworks. One of the findings that are extremely relevant today is the ways in which we measure loss are exclusionary and predicted on systems of documentation. So when we're talking about sourcing data, asking for data from our community, from organizations on the ground responding to disasters, what we saw after the 2017 wildfires, and we state in this report, is that we often measure fire losses through acres destroyed and structures lost. And this privileges both land and property ownership. Death resulting from disasters are measured by death certificates. And this assumes that all deaths are uniformly measurable, while also relying on a system that demands that human bodies demonstrate their legal legitimacy. And while homeowners can receive recompense through disaster assistance, insurance claims, or lawsuits, undocumented assets are not similarly recognized as losses. And the reason why I bring this up is because it's relevant today in how we're seeing emergency rental assistance, the emergency rental assistance being distributed throughout the state because of UndocuFund's success in the community and our constant challenging and conversations with the county to center undocumented residents during disasters. North Bay Organizing Project was selected as one of the organizations to distribute and administer emergency rental assistance during the current pandemic response. And what we have seen is that, again, those who are the legitimate, there's a whose debt counts is being again determined by the ways in which we measure who the ways in which we measure loss. And what we're seeing is that those who had to incur debt either through credit card or through sourcing assistance from family members, that debt doesn't count. And who most likely did that, we're seeing that it's our immigrant and undocumented residents who didn't have access or the ability to just stop working. And so the other finding that I wanted to highlight was just the ways in which existing institutions historically thought of as support systems don't necessarily serve everyone in the same way. And that is because, and we have since 2017 challenged this and seen great efforts by our county since then to ensure that mechanisms are set up and that organizations like NBOP and others who have been frontline communities responding to communities that are typically left out and marginalized are actually at the forefront of the response. And so it's that navigating of and leveraging of available funds to make sure it goes to frontline communities that has happened, so that it's not just funds going to the larger, more massive nonprofits, but actual grassroots base building organizations as well. And I think I might be at time. How am I, Alan?
You're at time, but we can maybe I have a follow-up question for you in terms of some of the information, like you talk about some of the information around, data gaps in tracking, how undocumented folks are being impacted or not there. So you talk about, deaths are not counted, right? Counted, like differently. What other type of information do you see that undocumented folks are not being counted? Would you say wildfire smoke or, socioeconomic harm or other things?
Absolutely. So the intersections and the overlaps are there. And so the ways, so the overlaps with labor and those who are the same folks we saw impacted and having a need for wage replacement, but couldn't access your typical EDD or other forms of wage replacement available to legal residents, are the same folks who couldn't access that during the pandemic as well. And so when we looked at what labor forces that affected, it was definitely the farm worker community, those who have informal work through their own businesses, or domestic workers, and so we did see that, and so we see that overlap, and that's where it. Sorry, there's a child screaming next door. Sorry about that. I hope you can't hear that, but I apologize. I got distracted. I don't think I answered that question, Alan, but I can continue.
Yes, I think you answered the question around, many of the data that we are not collecting from the undocumented folks are the same data that we are not collecting, in COVID-19 pandemic. And I think much of the policies, if it is correct, Gabriela, is that, many of our institutional systems, how we do relief and recovery funding are, distributed in equitable ways, because we, some of the data are not being collected, and some of the, and we have this missing population because we just don't know about them for a variety of reasons. So I think it's really working with frontline organizations like that, who serve undocumented folks, who know those populations, what their needs are, would be quite important moving forward.
Right, and I think that because the data doesn't exist, the efforts that frontline communities who have relationships with those communities, who have the testimonies and the real lived experiences with them, that needs to be able to translate into data that those community organizations know validates the experiences, rather than the reverse, which is sometimes what we see is data extraction being quantified and more extracted from community rather than lifting the data that currently exists as it's translated and interpreted by communities.
Great, thank you. So thank you so much, Gabby. So we are open up. We have about 13 minutes. If there are any questions, feel free to chime in the chat box. Or if you want to say it verbally, feel free to raise your hand in the reaction button at the bottom. Jared, go ahead.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you all for your great presentations, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness. Gabriella, I wanted to just expand on your last answer and perhaps actually go in a slightly different direction, just as I've observed it from my work. And as Alan knows, he and I both had extensive work doing disaster response prior to getting into philanthropy. One of the ways in which I totally appreciate, and I really want to say thank you for highlighting the economic impact for a lot of folks, people who may not be property rich. We don't do a good job at measuring how they are impacted by disasters. If they lose their jobs or somehow their hours are reduced or whatever, those don't get captured a lot of times. I wonder though, to your point about saying that we have to support some of the smaller organizations, where it is oftentimes the larger organizations who have the money and decide how to award financial assistance to victims, right? That could be Catholic Charities, that could be Red Cross, that could be state assistance programs, and even FEMA, whether or not pushing them to also account for economic impacts in their formulas for awarding financial assistance would seem to me to be a very fertile use, a fertile ground for advocacy, as opposed to just focusing on smaller groups that might have more connectivity to those communities. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't think it's an either or. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of heard it like I don't think it's an either or, it's an and. However, centering those most impacted and ensuring that whoever is in their work truly centering those most impacted and at the front line is definitely, there's impact there if agencies like Catholic Charities or larger organizations are able to also identify within themselves the kind of data and who they're I think they could learn from, and we've all been learning from each other of. And DocuFund, the key measurement that they've used is, did you live in one, if you're undocumented, and then two, did you live in an area, an evacuation zone, or in an area that was affected by the fire? And that's all. And so when I think that we could make a lot of advancement for our communities if we take away some of those barriers to accessing supports and funds for people to, and we trust individuals to be able to meet their own basic needs with the funds made available to them, understanding and acknowledging that there is more loss in our community than just property loss that we need to account for.
And I think this question, Jared question, I think the concept can also apply to many of the climate risk and the environmental movements. And so I'm going to kind of extend that question to Sona and Ami. I think there has been quite a bit of conversation as to, if we're going to hold accountable to other big organizations like the Red Cross and Catholic Charities, should we hold accountable to all these big green organizations like, Sierra Club or other big greens that are doing this work? So that, we can direct channel the funds. Are there any, pluses and minuses to that strategy? I hope that I'm phrasing that question correctly. And then after this, I'm going to have Lauren come up. Yep.
I can start and just say, I do think in the broader dialogue around climate resilience, there is a shift that's needed to really kind of as Gabby was mentioning too, center the leadership of grassroots organizations, EJ and equity organizations that are leading the charge here, because we're often most closely connected to the communities that are experiencing these impacts. However, a lot of the solutions being designed historically to this day in California are really dominated by sort of those mainstream environmental and natural resources group who have a lot of power and influence in shaping the direction of the field. So it's still a lot of work we've been doing to socialize our leadership, I guess, and our expertise in doing the research, the advocacy, and now really shaping agency projects. But it's not without, having to fight for that visibility and influence. But the reality is, in the context of, the California work, we're really grateful that we're showing a model of what it means to really partner with EJ and equity groups from the beginning in the design of the project of this mapping platform and how it's disseminated and used by policymakers. And so it's a more robust process, and I think more effective because we've been at the table and really been shaping it prior to it being sort of a concept that we really said, this is the need coming up from our advocacy. I don't know if you would add anything, Sona.
Thanks, Ami. It's a really good question, Alan. And yeah, just building on what Ami said, I think the accountability piece that you're teasing out is really important here. And in addition to holding a lot of mainstream environmental organizations accountable, I think that has to happen across all sectors, including the state itself. And just thinking about right now, we're in the midst of finalizing a climate budget for the state of California. And so much of the focus under climate resilience is focused on natural resources and really leaves out community resilience that Ami has been speaking to. And so I think there needs to be more visibilization of not only do we need to protect our natural resources and infrastructure, which is so key to building resilience, but it can't be at the expense of communities and populations that are already very vulnerable. We really need a holistic strategy that addresses all of these different forms of resilience at the same time.
Great, thank you. And Lauren, if you can unmute yourself, you're up next.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning. Thank you all for your presentations. As someone who actually grew up in a very climate impacted place. I grew up in Houston, so I'm used to hurricanes every other year and things like that. It's great to hear about the calculation of just kind of things like cost of illness and really looking at vulnerabilities beyond some of the typical metrics that I guess are also outlined by the federal government and states, and how you can answer a lot of questions for a lot of different departments. So I wanted to know, and some of the work, and I guess, and also some of the tools that you're creating, do you have a metric for energy impacts as it relates to not only are these communities vulnerable when it comes to climate disasters, but for example, last summer we had rolling blackouts. And so do you have anything as it relates to vulnerable infrastructure impacting vulnerable communities? And then a follow-up question to that is also, when it comes to recovery, how do you hold municipalities and communities accountable for making sure that recovery doesn't create community displacement, especially for people who are already vulnerable, especially, and so building on to the question that was asked before. So if you need me to repeat that, happy to do it.
Thank you, Lauren. Anyone wants to chime in first?
I could go real quick.
Or maybe Teresa. Teresa, yes, Teresa, go first.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that some of those data sets, so we're basically talking about service interruptions, right? Particularly with wildfires, the power going out, the water going out, etc. These are things we know that are happening and are very, very poorly quantified. And so even basic numbers of how many people lost their power for how many days, how many households couldn't have, access their drinking water because of service disruptions, etc. This stuff is not being counted, so we can't even get sort of numbers of people impacted, much less than translate that into a cost. And it gets really complicated with power because we now have power safety shutoffs, right? And so a tool that the utilities are using to prevent wildfires themselves are turning into a disaster when the power is out, for large chunks of the population for days at a time. and we don't have very good tracking for those areas at all.
Great. And Gabby?
I was just going to give a concrete example of how we are working to hold county and city municipalities accountable for the response. And is in the development, just recently, our Just Recovery Partnership developed a network of Just Recovery promotoras, and these are 60 existing, established, trusted community leaders that come from NBOP and our cohort of Just Recovery partners. Women who have been in the trenches with community and have experienced going through different systems of response, and equipping them with a network of support to then trainings to get them ready and prepared to enter into public spaces virtually right now, but investing in them so that they are the ones holding our cities and municipalities accountable, because they are the ones who are seeing the effects directly. And so lifting up our leaders who are living this day in, day out to actually hold policymakers accountable for what responses and recoveries should look like for our communities.
Great. And thank you, Gabby. And we have quite a few more questions. So hopefully we have 1 more minute left. And therefore, I would love to have all of you be very, very succinct. Quick question. We have funders that fund in, post-disasters like emergency relief, recovery. We have funders that funds in the pre-disasters like climate resilience. For those that are funding in the climate, in the disaster relief and recovery, how might we expand their portfolio to start funding the more of the climate risk or climate resilience efforts? And vice versa. So maybe this will be my last question to all of you before we wrap up. Teresa, how about you go first?
So I was just one way to sort of spend more on the prevention and mitigation, but less on the back end is identifying maybe technologies or access that can just avoid the problem to begin with. So for example, access to AC is a huge way to avoid actually several different climate disasters. You can filter your air to prevent wildfire smoke, and you can help protect against extreme heat. Both of which appear to be killing quite a lot of Californians and have a bad habit of occurring at the same time. And so identifying these sort of investments in prevention that can avoid the costs later on would be, I think, a great way to start shifting the focus towards prevention and less on recovery.
Great. And Sona and Ami?
Happy to share real quickly. I think the key from my perspective is investing in social infrastructure. So what is needed to build community resilience? Thinking about safe and affordable transportation, equitable access to green space, urban tree canopy, clean energy. What is needed to help communities get through inevitable climate impacts?
Yeah, I would echo what Sona shared. I think that there's a lot of strategies, I think, in the social infrastructure dimension in particular, that bridge emergency preparedness and response and climate resilience, and think about this more holistically. So across climate risks and disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic and economic inequality and racial injustice, there's sort of shared community development and social infrastructure investments that can really be a model to address those intersecting crises, not necessarily siloed.
Thank you, Ami. And Gabby?
I would say that because of the how housing has an availability of affordable housing is exacerbating during disasters, expand portfolios by building relationships and funding mutual aid support efforts done in communities such as tenant unions, which currently are responding in ways that a government response is not nimble and able to despite the good intentions of getting this money out to communities through disaster recovery. So I would say support tenant unions, because they are the mutual support systems that are on the ground responding to the housing crises that are further exacerbated by disasters and the very real impacts of climate change.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of you who have joined, and thank you all the speakers. I know we ran just a little bit late, but I just want to share in the screen, if you are interested in contacting any of them for further information, the contact information are there, or you can feel free to contact me. So once again, thank you so much, Sona, Ami, Teresa, and Gabriela, for all of your contributions and expertise. And to all of the funders who have joined us, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. And stay safe. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.